you're caught underneath this rainbow, it's going to feel pretty cold and raw, pretty miserable. Behind it, cooler but bright with some sunshine and one or two showers. But the cool air won't last. This area of high pressure reinforces the weather up from the southwest during Tuesday and Wednesday, but it will cause a northwest-southeast split. Lots of sunshine in the south, windier and wetter across the northwest corner, but mild for all, Andrew.
Could be a lot worse. Now, Labour are promising to crack down on rich tax cheats by shaking up the taxman at Customs and Revenue. But from tax exile donors in today's papers to the leader himself, how snowy white are their own underclothes? And, more significant still, what's Ed Balls planning for ordinary taxpayers? Well, the Shadow Chancellor is with me. Welcome, Mr. Balls. Now, first of all, can you explain to myself and to the viewers what is the moral distinction between a variation of deed, as Ed Miliband did to avoid tax, and a family tax trust, as Lord Fink is accused of doing?
Look, people want, ordinary people want, to know that people who are rich and powerful pay their fair share of tax. There shouldn't be one rule for one group and one rule for another. In the case of Ed Miliband, he paid all his taxes, and that's important.
But he didn't pay as much tax as he would have done if there had not been a variation of deed.
Look, he paid his capital gains tax. The issue is...
he illegally found a way to pay less tax, which is exactly what Lord Fink did, and yet you regard Lord Fink as dodgy and smelly and all the rest of it, and I'm not saying you guys, but your leader has been up to something not that dissimilar in most people's view.
Look, Ed Miliband has made the position very clear. He paid his fair share of tax. And look, if you don't mind, let's get to the heart of the issue of the last week and what's gone on here. It's not the issue of Lord Fink and his particular tax arrangements. That isn't the heart of this issue. The issue started a week ago with the revelation that HSBC had 1,000 individuals where they'd been evading tax, breaking the law. And what happened is that the guy in charge of the bank, Lord Green, was a minister. And David Cameron and George Osborne didn't ask the questions about Lord Green, and there's only been one prosecution. And I'm afraid, hang on, Andrew, the evidence is the Conservatives from the Treasury and in Number 10 turned a blind eye to what was happening at HSBC. That's what makes people angry. The idea there's one rule for everybody else, you track that on benefit sheets, but when it comes to the rich and powerful, they don't ask the questions. For a week, we had no word from Treasury ministers at all as to why this has been such a failure in the Treasury and HMRC. We're the ones who will act.
Can I ask you to remind us who was City Minister at the time all of this happened and whether he asked the questions?
But, Andrew, that is a ridiculous question. It's a ridiculous question.
You were City Minister. Why is it a ridiculous question? This happened on your watch.
Andrew, the evidence of systemic tax evasion by HSBC came to the Revenue in May 2010. 3 years after I was a minister.
But it was going on while you were a minister, and for whatever reason, ministers, including yourself, failed to get a grip of this.
Andrew, it was going on in Switzerland with law breaking. At any point in the past and at any point in the future, if I'm the Chancellor, I will not turn a blind eye to law breaking. The fact is, though, the evidence wasn't presented to me in 2007. It was presented to the HMRC in May 2010.
But your critics say that under Labour's watch, banking regulation was too lax, people got away with all sorts of things they shouldn't have got away with. And that is a fair accusation, is it not?
We're talking here about people breaking the law by evading tax, and HSBC doing so in a systemic way with tax evasion. It came to light in May 2010, at the time the government changed. It was been in the public domain for 5 years, and last week we were told the same Tories who a week ago were alleging that I should have known when it wasn't in the public domain, suddenly said, even though it's been in the public domain for 5 years, they only just found out. It's a joke of an excuse from the Conservative Party, and it explains why, unlike me, I've been doing interviews all week, there's not been any word from George Osborne or any Treasury Minister for a week. Why wasn't Lord Green asked the questions? Why only one prosecution? Is it Ken Clarke is right? Because you've got a Conservative Party in hock to hedge funds and large donors, and they're not willing to ask the questions. They turn a blind eye. If you want a government to sort this out, you'll have to have a change of government, because the Conservatives have not acted.
There are two substantial Labour donors, Vince Dale and Sir David Gerrard, attacked in the front pages of newspapers today for doing similar kinds of things to Lord Fink.
Well, look, of course there's going to be mud thrown this weekend after Ed
you support what they have
Miliband has
done?
led on this issue. Look, it's not for me to know the details of what every individual has done. It would be improper
George
for me.
Osborne and David Cameron could say exactly the same thing about a lot of people who are at the black and white ball.
Well, as you say,
It's not for me to know. How can we?
As you say, the Conservatives have a lot of millionaire donors going to the black and white ball, unlike Labour.
And you have millionaire donors attacked on the front pages for using tax havens and all sorts of.
But the issue is, last Wednesday, Ed Miliband asked the question of the Tory Treasurer, Lord Fink. He was on the list of people being looked at by HMRC. Did David Cameron ask the question when that information was available? The issue is not, look, if there's anybody who should be investigated, they should be investigated. Okay. In the case of David Goward and Dale
And you're completely happy that a deed of variation, as used by your leader, is an acceptable, morally acceptable thing to do to avoid paying a bit more tax?
I think that Ed Miliband paid all the tax which was due, and we are the party.
Not quite an answer.
We are the party who will crack down on tax planning, on systemic practices where people are trying to avoid paying the tax Parliament intends in order to get round the law, and that's wrong. And we'll act in the way the Tories haven't.
Sorry, would you crack down on variation of deed, that kind of tax planning? Because Gordon Brown, for whom you both worked, said this was the wrong kind of thing to do. He was against it.
Look, what we will do is we will look at every area of tax
including
law.
This one.
I set out a whole series of areas last Wednesday. I will look at every area. The intention of Parliament. I'll look at every area.
Okay.
The intention of Parliament must be delivered. In the case of an individual savings account, that's there to allow people to pay less tax on savings, or the film tax relief, or entrepreneurs relief. We have ways in which people can sensibly plan for their children and for their death and for their inheritance. But if people are actually setting up false structures to avoid paying tax, or going off to live in Switzerland in order to avoid paying their fair share of tax, we'll crack down. That's what people want. We'll do that in the way the Tories have completely failed.
The other Ed said yesterday that you're going to have a root and branch reform of HMRC. Do you regard that as having the wrong culture, not being fit for purpose at the moment? There have been all sorts of stories about cosy suppers between the bosses of HMRC and people who are avoiding their taxes, and sweetheart deals and so forth.
Look, I think there's some good people in the HMRC. They're under huge pressure because there's been large cuts in staff numbers. I don't know whether the issue about not doing prosecutions and instead collecting revenue has come from ministers, or whether that's a decision within the department. But I want to make sure that they've got the resources they need, that the legal framework is right, the culture is tough.
Do you think the culture is tough enough at the moment?
Well, look, when we brought together the old Inland Revenue and Customs and Excise, that was because we wanted to get some of the tough investigation, custom and excise type culture into the revenue.
Hasn't worked, has it?
I'm not sure it's worked well enough, but that in the end, of course, depends upon the remit set by the Chancellor and whether the resourcing and the message goes in. My fear in the case of HSBC and the HMRC is the message has gone in from the top of the government, from the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, not to engage enough, to turn a blind eye. It's why they didn't ask the difficult questions about Lord Green. We will send a different signal into this machine. We want to collect the tax, we'll toughen up the law, and we will make sure that the revenue is collected.
Now, you've signed up for the government's fiscal deficit reduction plan, which means about £30 billion of austerity in the next government, if you're in government. Your leader has said in the past that he thinks the right balance between spending cuts and tax rises is about 50-50. Do you agree with that?
Well, look, I dispute the premise of your question, obviously, because the 30 billion number is not the government's fiscal objective.
It's the structural deficit, so it's a fair number.
No, look,
and certainly the proportion is a fair question.
The government says they're seeking to get the overall budget into surplus by 2019. That goes well beyond our commitment to a current budget balance. That's the thing which the Institute for Fiscal Studies have said would require colossal cuts in public spending, and the OBR said would take us back to 1930s
Absolutely.
levels.
And the IFS also said that your plans required new tax rises to pay down the deficit, not the 50p thing. Though, since I'm on 50p, are you going to go ahead with 50p now that we know actually that the rich are paying more since the rate has come down to 45p than they were before, both proportionally and in absolute terms?
We absolutely will go ahead with putting the 50p back to 50p while we get the deficit down.
It could lose you money.
Because it will bring in revenue, absolutely. Even the most
That's not what the official figures say.
Oh, come on.
The official figures say that the rich have paid more taxes since the rate went down to 45p.
the official figures do not make the causal link you're implying at all. The reason why the numbers have gone up is actually because of changes to pension tax relief, which Alistair Darling introduced in the first budget of 2010. Even the most cautious HMRC estimates say there'll be revenue collected from this, and I think they underestimate it. What we're going to do is get the deficit down. We'll balance the budget and cut the deficit every year.
You need a lot more from tax to do that, however, than you've announced so far. And I'm just asking you where it's going to come from. VAT or revenue, excise revenue duty?
Well, look, the party which raised VAT was the Conservative Party. The Conservatives are the ones with unfunded tax commitments. The Institute for Fiscal Studies have said we've been the most cautious of the three parties, but our approach is different from the Conservative approach in three ways. First of all, we will cut spending until we get the deficit down, but not back to the 1930s levels.
Okay.
Secondly, we will raise the top rate of tax. We'll take the winter allowance away from the richest pensioners.
I say to you that you will raise the 40p rate of tax and the bottom rate of tax as well. As sure as eggs is eggs, you are going to raise income tax if you're in the Treasury again.
Well, I don't know on what basis you're making that.
Because you have to get rid of the deficit. Look, and you're not going to make huge swinging cuts as the Conservatives are doing it in public spending and welfare. So where else is money coming from? It has to come from tax rises.
Well, you see, this is the sort of George Osborne mindset problem.
It seems to me to be basic logic.
No, it's not actually, because there's three ways you get the deficit down. By cutting spending, which we'll do,
yes.
By some fair increases on tax at the top and the mansion tax and the winter allowance, which we'll do. But thirdly, unless the economy is growing more strongly and bringing in the tax revenues, the reason why George Osborne has failed so badly on the deficit in this
Parliament... So you need economic growth, but you're still going to have to plug that deficit. And I don't think you're going to do the kind of deep public spending cuts the Conservatives are committed to, and therefore you're left with tax rises. And I'm just asking you which taxes are going to go up.
A fact from the Office of Budget Responsibility: if the economy simply grows by 0.2% a year in the next 5 years, by the end of the Parliament, the deficit is £15 billion lower. Tomorrow we're setting out a prosperity plan, but how we make sure, not by just concentrating on a few wealthy individuals, but on everybody, all small firms, all working people, we get the skills we need. I want a lower tax burden for small businesses than now and under the Tories in the future. A British investment bank, getting the apprentices we need. Unless you get growth, unless we actually stay in Europe and win the investment we need, then we're going to carry on with George Osborne's failing plan. And I'm going to do things in a more balanced and fairer way.
One other issue. You may have seen Nicola Sturgeon on the sofa a couple of weeks ago, laying out her red lines for any kind of deal with Labour after the election. And she talked about Trident and getting rid of Trident, which I know is a problem for the Labour Party. But she also said she criticised you for going along with the Conservatives' austerity plans and said there has been an end to austerity economics. And that suggests to a lot of people that you can't do a deal with Nicola Sturgeon on that basis, can you? You'd have to tear up your own economic plan.
George Osborne's austerity economics has failed. He said he'd balance the books, and he failed to do so. He's now trying to carry on in the next Parliament with even more of the same failing plan.
Let's talk about Nicola Sturgeon rather than George Osborne, if we might.
I'm just explaining to you, I'm not going to sign up to George Osborne's austerity economics. I'm not going to have spending cuts.
What about Nicola Sturgeon's assertions?
But the question you asked me
was
whether I was signing up...
Would you do a deal with Nicola Sturgeon? You talked about George Osborne.
No, you asked me whether Nicola Sturgeon is right to say I'm signing up to George Osborne's plan. And I said to you, absolutely not, because we've got a balanced plan, a fair plan, a steady plan, a plan which will get the deficit down through growth and jobs and fair action on tax at the top and on some spending cuts. Now, I don't think Nicola Sturgeon is going to sign up to anybody's plan, because I think probably she's just sort of thinks we shouldn't deal with the deficit at all. I disagree with her. We'll cut the deficit. We'll do it in a fair way and a Labour way.
Ed Balls, always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, to one of the